Hi guys! Can you believe that we've almost completed Chapter 10? Here are your objectives. We started in Section 1 with Imperialism in America, on to Section 2, the Spanish-American War, Section 3, Acquiring New Lands, and we have now arrived at Section 4, America as a World Power. In September of 1901, President William McKinley was shot and killed. Keep in mind, America had recently established itself as a world superpower by means of imperialism, but there were still many Americans who strongly opposed this, also known as anti-imperialists. After the assassination, Vice President Teddy Roosevelt took over and was unwilling to allow the imperial powers of Europe to control the world's political and economic destiny. Around this time in East Asia, there was a war going on between Russia and Japan, known as the Russo-Japanese War. Eventually, in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt mediated a settlement to end this war and ended up being awarded the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize. By the time Roosevelt became president, many Americans, including Roosevelt, felt that the United States needed a canal cutting across Central America in attempt to connect the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. By creating a canal, the travel time for commercial and military ships would be greatly reduced. In 1850, Britain and the United States shared rights to the canal, and in 1901, Britain gave all the rights to the United States. In the late 1800s, a French company tried to build a canal in Panama and had failed. After convincing the United States to buy its claim, in 1903, Roosevelt and Congress decided to buy it for $40 million. Before beginning construction, the United States had to get permission from Colombia because they owned Panama. When the negotiations broke out, the Panamanians rebelled, and on the 3rd of November in 1903, nearly a dozen United States warships were present as Panama declared its independence. Construction of the canal is considered one of the world's greatest engineering feats. Builders overcame disease, injuries, and many even died. The actual construction began in 1904 with jobs of draining swamps and clearing brush. 10 years later, in August of 1914, the canal opened for business. Even though Latin American relations were damaged, the economic benefits the United States was reaping in compensated for this in pretty much every way possible. Roosevelt was determined to keep the United States' stance as a world power, and especially predominant in the Caribbean and Central America. In the late 19th century, many Latin American nations had borrowed large sums of money from European banks in order to modernize, keep up with the rest of the world. Roosevelt decided to remind European powers of the Monroe Doctrine. This demanded European countries to stay out of the affairs of Latin American nations. When Roosevelt said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," he was referring to his foreign policy, stating very plainly and boldly he wanted to negotiate peace but disagree and answer to the United States military. In 1904, Roosevelt added the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, promising the use of force should European countries try to intervene in Latin America. And as a direct result, during the next decade, the United States exercised its police power on several occasions. In 1911, the United States loaned money to Nicaragua to pay its debt after a rebellion and also gained control of the state-owned railroad system and National Bank. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson gave the Monroe Doctrine a moral tone. According to Wilson's missionary diplomacy, the United States had a moral responsibility to deny recognition to any Latin American government it viewed as oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile to United States interests. With this, he also pressured the Western Hemisphere to establish democratic governments. The Mexican Revolution almost immediately put this policy to the test. After being ruled for more than 3 decades by a military dictator, the United States really liked Mexico's leader, Diaz. Diaz encouraged foreign investments, making foreigners, mostly Americans, rich, and it resulted in the common people of Mexico being extremely poor. In 1911, Francisco Madero overthrew the old government. Unable to withhold his promises of a democratic state, Gen Huerta took over the government and had Madero killed, but within days was too murdered. Wilson, who did not like Huerta, was waiting for an opportunity to act against him. In April of 1914, one of Huerta's officers arrested a small group of American soldiers. Even though they apologized and released them as soon as they found out who they were, Wilson used this as his excuse and sent Marines to occupy Veracruz, an important Mexican port. When countries such as Brazil and Chile stepped in and tried to mediate between the United States and Mexico, both refused the request. Huerta's regime eventually collapsed, and Carranza took over. Later, the United States troops withdrew, and Wilson finally recognized the Mexican government. Even though the United States now recognized the Mexican government, Carranza did not have full support in Mexico. 2 rebels who opposed him were named Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. Villa requested the aid and support of the United States, but Wilson still favored Carranza. In January of 1916, Carranza invited American engineers to operate mines in northern Mexico, but before they reached the mines, Villa's men took the Americans off a train and shot and killed each one of them. With the American public demanding revenge, President Wilson ordered General John J. Pershing, should sound familiar, a middle school in Springfield, to get 15,000 of his soldiers and take them to Mexico. Mexicans grew angrier over the United States invasion of their land. Carranza demanded the removal of troops from America, but Wilson refused. However, in the end, both sides ended up backing down. Because the United States was facing possible war in Europe at the time, they needed peace on its southern border. Did not want to have 2 wars going on at the same time. In the end, Carranza ruled oppressively until 1920. Also, supporting everything we have learned in this chapter about America, the United States intervention in Mexico proved again to be the model for imperialist beliefs in our country.